Segment 18A, Turn and Face the Strange. Ivan the Terrible had spent the first 18 years of his reign, 1547 to 1565, building a Russian empire up, and the rest of it, 1565 to 1584, tearing it down. As we've seen, the time of troubles, 1598 to 1612, which followed the death of Ivan's son Fyodor, tested the new nation's fiber in many ways. They had false Dmitries, Polish and Swedish invasions, murdered czars, class war between peasants and boyars. But as it turned out, the gathering of the lands begun by Grand Prince Ivan I, that is, Ivan Moneybags of Moscow, was more than just a mere land grab. Welded together by their Kievan Rus heritage and held together by the Russian Orthodox Church, the people of Holy Russia rose to the challenge of becoming the best Third Rome they could be. At first, the early Romanovs focused on things the early Muscovite princes had done well sometimes, easing tensions between the classes and avoiding senseless wars. But changes would eventually have to be made. The Western world was modernizing at a far faster rate than Russia was. If Russia let herself fall too far behind, the Poles and the Swedes and the Germans could very well come back, perhaps for good. In segment 18B, Rise of the Romanovs, the Zemsky Sobor elects the reluctant Mikhail Romanov, 16-year-old son of the Patriarch Filaret, to serve as Tsar Mikhail I. The dynasty Mikhail founded ruled Russia for more than 3 centuries. The Patriarch Filaret did most of the thinking during his son Mikhail's reign, reinforcing the close connection between the Orthodox Church and the Russian state. Mikhail's son Alexei, 1645 to 1676, faced political challenges, such as renewal of the war with Sweden, renewal of the war with Poland, internal uprisings, and the Patriarch Nikon's reformation of the Russian Orthodox Church. Nikon felt that Russian Orthodoxy had to be somehow purified if Russia were to claim Byzantium's role as successor to the Roman Empire. Even though he had Alexei's support, Nikon's reforms caused a lasting split in Russian culture. Segment 18C, Peter the Great, examines the career of Russia's most remarkable leader, Tsar Peter the Great, 1682 to 1725. With his hard-charging energy, Peter literally dragged his nation with him into 18th century European life. On territory which he and his modernized army captured from the Swedes, he built Russia's window on the Baltic Sea, the beautiful city of St. Petersburg. But visionary as he was, Peter did not foresee the chaos which would follow his death, or he would have bothered to provide for a successor. For nearly all the rest of the 18th century, Russia was ruled by females. The first 3 of these women to rule were usually content to let their friends and advisors of the male persuasion run the government while they had fun. The 4th woman to come to the Russian throne was Catherine the Great, and she was fully Peter's equal. Segment 18D, Russia as European power, provides a snapshot of Russia's early days as a European power, assessing Peter's influence on Russian life for good and for bad, and for exam questions. For example, many of the great and necessary cultural advances that Peter promoted, such as the building of St. Petersburg itself, came literally out of the peasants' hides. But Peter did not just look westward to Europe. To the south, Peter tried but failed to get his hands on the rich farmlands of modern-day Ukraine. Peter had better luck extracting wealth from Siberia, but unfortunately, this wealth he got benefited only the Russian crown, along with selected nobles, The peasants were left out. Segment 18b, Rise of the Romanovs. In 1612, Russia stood at a turning point. Ivan the Terrible had spent the first half of his reign building a Russian empire, and the second half tearing it down. The time of troubles, 1598 to 1612, which followed the death of Ivan's successor Fyodor, tested the new nation's fiber in many ways. It offered false Dmitris, Polish and Swedish invasions, murdered czars, and class war between peasants and boyars. Yet the gathering of the lands, begun back in the days of Grand Prince Ivan Moneybags, turned out to be more than just a land grab. United by their Kievan Rus heritage and held together by the Russian Orthodox Church, the people of Holy Russia rose to the challenge of becoming the Third Rome. When the Zemsky Sobor met in 1612, there was no question about a democratic or representative government. Russia was ruled by its upper class, but Russia's upper class could not rule itself. When Kievan Rus had disintegrated into a patchwork of appanage principalities, it only let the Mongols come in and take over. Russia needed another strong Tsar. The new Tsar would need to be conservative in social and religious matters, not so dominating that he would overwhelm the boyars, but yet strong enough to lead Russia in the right direction. The Zemsky Sobor, Assembly of the People, deliberated long and hard before choosing a candidate acceptable to everyone. This was Mikhail Romanov, 16-year-old grandnephew of Ivan the Terrible's first wife, Anastasia, and son of the current Orthodox Patriarch Filaret. On February 21st, 1613, young Mikhail was elected Tsar. But first, he had to be found. This took about a month, because Mikhail's mother argued that the last few Tsars had come to sad ends, and she was right. Finally, Mikhail accepted the Zemsky Sobor's argument that he, Michael, was the only one to save Holy Russia in these troubled times. On June 22nd, 1613, Mikhail Romanov was crowned in Moscow as Tsar of all the Russias. He soon signed peace treaties with Sweden, 1617, and Poland, 1619. The second of these treaties brought home from exile Mikhail's father, the Patriarch Filaret. In his earlier secular life as the boyar Fyodor Nikitich Romanov, Filaret had been considered as a possible successor to the late Tsar Fyodor, but he gave way to Boris Godunov. Boris ordered Fyodor Romanov to become a monk, which he did, and he drove Filaret back into the camp of the false Dmitri brothers. But 8 years in Polish exile had earned Filaret the good estimation of the Russian people. All Russia welcomed him back home in 1619, especially his son, the Tsar Mikhail. Indeed, most scholars regard Filaret as the quiet senior partner in his son's government. The Zemsky Sobor was now all but ignored. Mikhail continued the Muscovite tradition of binding the Russian peasants to the land. Those peasants who could escape fled to the Cossack territory in the south, Russia's version of the wild, wild American West. No questions asked, just do what you want. The remaining peasants, however, were stuck being serfs, little more than human farm machinery. After Filaret died in 1633, Mikhail flailed about on his own, allowing the Zemsky Sobor to meet again and trying to fend off raiding Tatars from the south. Mikhail's reign was not one of great achievements, but he lived up to the hopes placed in him when he was selected Tsar. He had left Russia strong and in good shape for his son and heir Alexei, and he successfully founded the Romanov dynasty, which would rule Russia, sometimes well and sometimes not, for the next 3 centuries. Like his father Mikhail, Tsar Alexei, ruled 1645 to 1676, was personally devout and leaned upon his advisors for guidance. The first of these, the boyar Boris Morozov, was a faithful public servant who somehow incurred public distrust. The Moscow Salt riots of 1648, in which even the Streltsy took the people's side, forced Alexei to exile Morozov and buy back the Streltsy's loyalty, much as a Roman emperor would buy the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard. The boyars, sensing weakness, basically forced Alexei to grant a legal code called the ulozhenie. The ulozhenie consolidated Russia's slaves and free peasants into a new, hereditary, and unchangeable serf class. If you weren't a noble, you were a serf. The serfs could only be owned by noblemen, but in return for the right to own serfs, noblemen had to serve in the Tsarist army. The 2 major military events of Alexei's reign were the Polish War and the Stenka-Razin revolt. The Polish War sprang out of Bogdan Khmelnytsky's 1648 Cossack revolt against Polish control. In 1653, with the Zemsky Sobor's consent, Alexei dispatched troops to take as much Polish territory as possible, always gathering the lands. Meanwhile, the Swedes jumped into the fight against the Ukrainian Cossacks. Desperate for help, the Cossacks signed a treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654. In return for Russian protection, the Cossacks acknowledged Russian overlordship over Ukraine. Interestingly enough, Russia and Ukraine are still arguing furiously over what this treaty really meant. In 1656, Alexei declared war on Sweden. Seizing the opportunity to regroup, Poland attacked Russia. Finally, in 1670, the 3 warring powers made peace. Russia had come out ahead on territory, but the Russian peasants were tired of having to fight the war in the army and having to pay for the war through their taxes. The Russian peasants responded gladly in 1670 to Stenka Razin's call for a peasant uprising. In fact, Razin's promises of a Russia ruled by Cossack ideals of liberty even found support in cities like Great Novgorod and Moscow itself. But the result was predictable. Razin's supporters either melted away or flat out turned on him. And in April 1671, he was drawn, that is to say dragged to death, and quartered, chopped up into fourths, at the Lobnoye Miesto, place of proclamations on Red Square. Oddly enough, Russians today remember Stenka Razin better than they remember Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich. The biggest shakeup of Alexei's reign occurred within the Russian Orthodox Church. In 1651, the Metropolitan Nikon became Alexei's main advisor in matters spiritual and temporal. This itself was not all that strange, given Tsar Mikhail's close relationship with his dad, Patriarch Filaret. Promoted in 1652 to Patriarch of Moscow, Nikon wanted to bring the Russian Orthodox Church back into line with that good old-time Greek Orthodox religion. Granted, the Russian Orthodox Church had gotten some rather interesting ideas of their own over the 6 centuries since Vladimir had adopted it. But it's not unusual for religions to adapt themselves to their believers' customs. In 1653, Nikon decided to restore all authentic Greek Orthodox practices. From that point on, for instance, the sign of the cross was to be made with not 2 fingers, but with 3 fingers, as in other Orthodox countries. The name of the Savior, was no longer to be spelled Isus, but as Iisus, and so on. Most Russian Orthodox believers resented these changes. Why should the Third Rome go back to Byzantine traditions? Many fought the reforms bitterly, sometimes even to the death. Even after Nikon fell from grace in 1658, the Church Council maintained that the changes were necessary. In 1667, those who believed in the old customs were formally excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church and forbidden to have priests. Many such old believers fled or were exiled to other countries. Some even holed themselves up in their homes or churches and burned themselves to death. Russia, though, was merely on the verge of far more radical change. Segment 18C, Peter the Great. Tsar Alexei died in 1676, succeeded by his eldest surviving son, Fyodor III. Like his father and grandfather, Fyodor III did not leave his personal mark upon Russia. So far, the Romanovs had been competent but not brilliant, keeping the boyars in line, avoiding aggressive wars, and not actively offending the peasantry. Fyodor died in 1682, leaving behind two full siblings, 27-year-old Sophia and 16-year-old Ivan, and a 10-year-old half-brother named Peter. At first, young Peter's mother, Natalia, had him crowned as Tsar. Then the faction of Alexei's first wife, that is, the mother of Fyodor, Sophia, and Ivan, got control. Ivan and Peter, because they were boys, became co-tsars, while Sophia served as regent and effectively called all the shots. She and her advisor/lover, Prince Golitsyn, sought alliances with the West and tried to expand Russia's boundaries southward. Ivan was feeble-minded and uninterested in holding power, but Peter yearned to be Tsar. In 1689, Sophia tried to rouse up the Streltsy against Peter and declare herself Tsarina. But the Streltsy refused to rise up, and instead Sophia was banished to a nunnery. Ivan was allowed to keep his empty share of the throne until he died in 1696, leaving Peter, at long last, as sole Tsar. At last, the Romanov dynasty had produced a ruler who would leave a mark upon Russia. Young as he was, Peter realized that Russia was backward economically, militarily, and intellectually. There would be no chance of equality with the West unless Russia adopted emerging technologies, improved its economy, and made its government more effective. In other words, Peter decided to westernize Russia. Peter's first step was to experience Western culture at first hand. He spent 1697 and 1698 traveling, supposedly in disguise, through Germany, the Netherlands, and Great Britain. Peter never achieved his goal of starting a great European crusade against the Ottoman Turks. But he did learn a wide range of trades, including shipbuilding and dentistry. And he recruited Westerners to come to Russia and teach Russians their ways. Peter's tour was cut short in 1698 by news that the Streltsy had revolted, with the intent of putting Sophia on the throne. Peter rushed back to Moscow and put the uprising down in streams of blood, himself helping execute more than 1,200 Streltsy right out on Red Square. Sophia was sent back to the convent for good, giving Peter the free hand he needed to start westernizing Russia. Peter's first initiative was intentionally drastic. He outlawed the long beards and outlawed the long flowing caftans, which were part of a boyar's traditional dress. Peter preferred going clean-shaven and wearing Western clothes, and he expected his court to do likewise. Peter also made changes to the Russian Orthodox Church. When the Patriarch of Moscow died in 1700, Peter refused to let a new patriarch be elected, which left the church effectively headless. Shortly before his death, Peter put the church in the hands of a holy synod of 10 churchmen appointed by the Tsar. Orthodoxy would always remain at the center of Russian life, but from this point on, it would also be an instrument of the Tsar's government. Peter's greatest dream was to establish what he called a window on the Baltic. In Kievan Rus's earliest days, Great Novgorod, although inland itself, had been a great center of Baltic Sea trade. Ivan the Terrible had opened up the port of Arkhangelsk in 1553, but it was ice-blocked half the year. Ivan's attempt to find a Baltic outlet resulted in the disastrous Livonian War. First, Peter needed to conquer a site for the western port he coveted. Peter's first campaign against the Swedes in 1700 ended in disaster. The poorly trained Russian army ran in terror from the smaller but more disciplined force of King Charles XII. For some bizarre reason, Charles XII then turned his back on Russia and then declared war on Poland. This decision gave Peter more time to modernize the Russian army and to conquer a swampy patch on the Baltic Sea where, in 1703, the city of St. Petersburg was founded. Whatever time, money, and energy Peter could spare for his wars against Sweden was devoted to this new obsession. In 1707, Peter even offered to give to Charles XII practically everything on the Baltic Sea but St. Petersburg and the land connecting it to the rest of Russia. But Charles was blockheaded. He invaded Russia in 1708. Given Russia's lack of natural defenses, Peter resorted to a time-honored Russian tactic, retreating, and leaving nothing behind him but scorched earth and devastation. He drew Charles XII ever deeper into Russia and farther away from his lines of supply and Sweden. Since the ground was burned and everything was destroyed, Charles XII could not live off the land. On June 28, 1709, Russia defeated Sweden at the Battle of Poltava. Carried off the battlefield on a stretcher, Charles XII fled to the Ottoman Empire, where he was forced to stay for 4 years. Charles returned to Sweden and resumed the fight against Russia, but died frustrated in 1718. In 1721, Russia and Sweden signed a peace treaty, which marked Sweden's end as a major European military power, and it enabled Peter to begin calling himself not just Tsar or Caesar, but the Emperor, Imperator of all Russia. When anyone refused to cooperate with his grand dreams, Peter was furious. Peter thought nothing of personally cutting or pulling off the beards and caftans of boyars who still went for that old Russian look. Peter's oldest child, the Tsarevich Alexei, was a great disappointment to him. Unlike Peter himself, who openly scorned religion, Alexei was very devout as a Christian, and he did not want to succeed Peter as Tsar. Peter couldn't understand this. He hounded poor Alexei until Alexei escaped from Russia in 1716. Then Peter lured Alexei back, tortured him terribly, and allowed him to die in prison 2 years later. Peter suspected his beloved second wife, Tsarina Catherine, of having taken a Dutch lover, the brother, oddly enough, of Peter's own former mistress, and he had this Dutch man drawn and quartered. The greatest illustration, however, of Peter's obsessive drive was the building of his beloved St. Petersburg. Because it was built during wartime, St. Petersburg had to be not just a westernized Russian city, but a naval and military base. So Peter spared no expense. Peasant laborers were forced in by the tens of thousands. When they died of overwork, malnutrition, disease, or all of the above, Peter just sent in more. To this day, the natives of St. Petersburg will tell you that their city is built upon bones. Peter also hired the best architects, craftsmen, and materials available. For years, it was illegal to construct a stone building in Russia anywhere but in St. Petersburg. In 1712, Peter officially named his new city the capital of Russia, St. Petersburg, which is Dutch for the city of St. Peter. Lavishly adorned by his successors, terribly tested by siege during the Second World War, this gorgeous city is but the greatest of Peter's indelible marks upon the Russian state. I've been there twice, and I can't wait to go there again. Segment 18D, Russia as a European Power. Peter the Great made Russia a full-fledged European power. He had streamlined the imperial bureaucracy, but even so, Russia was an enormous country. The farther out the Russian Empire reached, the more likely it was that the actual ruling was done by the local nobility. The military was strong and usually victorious, provided that the lines of supply did not get too long, as often happened when fighting the Ottoman Empire. The army was also very expensive to maintain, whether or not it was being used. Most importantly, Russia was now economically and diplomatically a part of Western society. Through Peter's support, Russian industry was growing fast, even though it was geared almost completely to military production. To keep pace with the other European powers, Peter founded colleges devoted to navigation, to medicine, and to science. To educate the Russian upper classes of their nation's public affairs, Peter also established Russia's first newspaper. And as the heart of this reoriented Russian Empire, he commissioned the building of the beautiful city of St. Petersburg. Yet these advantages had come at a cost. Since Peter had insisted on looking west, Russia's Slavic traditions were all too often neglected. Peter had recreated the Russian upper classes in his own image, but they had become literally too Western in their ways for the Russian peasantry's liking. By moving the capital to St. Petersburg, Peter literally turned his back on the physical center of the Third Rome, Moscow. Both of these actions helped create the so-called dualized Russia of the westernized haves and of the traditionally Russified Russian have-nots. It was almost as though Russian society was evolving backwards into the old Roman patrician plebeian construct. Although Peter built universities, he also created a secret police which helped stifle Russian intellectual growth. Finally, Peter did nothing to better the lot of the average Russian peasants in their communes. Peter depended on the local nobility to run his far-flung empire, and the local nobility depended on serf labor in order to stay solvent. Peter also refused to do anything to better the practice of agriculture. By the early 1700s, important advances had been made in the art of farming, but Peter made no effort to share them with the masses. He did, however, include the peasant masses in the so-called soul tax that he instituted in 1718. As a nice touch, he charged the so-called old believers double, once more thumbing his nose at Russia's traditions. The Russian Orthodox Church was effectively converted into an arm of the Russian state, keeping the peasants docile through the practice of their faith and promoting the Tsar's image as their God-given ruler. Clergymen were not educated in anything besides basic church literature. No effort was made to attract the better educated men into the clergy. Russians were expected to accept orthodoxy unquestioningly, just as they accepted the Tsar's authority. They were almost one and the same. Peter the Great was the first Tsar to claim the old Roman title Imperator, signifying that Russia had truly arrived as an empire. The process had begun with Grand Prince Ivan I, Moneybags, of Moscow in the 1300s. Bit by bit, old Moneybags and his successors built the Principality of Muscovy into Russia's leading city-state. After Ivan the Terrible was crowned Tsar in 1546, he conquered the Tatar Khanates of Kazan in 1552 and Astrakhan in 1556. Ivan wisely allowed the inhabitants to keep their Muslim faith and Muslim ways, and they responded by becoming loyal Russian subjects. However, Ivan's attempt to gain a Baltic seaport failed, and Ivan's antics during the Oprichnik days virtually invited neighbors like Sweden and the southern Tatars to invade Russia. The exploration of Siberia, which began during Ivan's reign, was almost an afterthought. Like their earlier Mongol overlords, the Russians had no desire to live on the conquered tundra. Instead, the Russians wanted to extort tribute, usually furs, from the poor tribesmen who lived there. When the Russians reached the Amur River, they made their first contact with Manchu China, which was then nearing the peak of its power. Russia was too weak to fight a war at such a distance with such a powerful Chinese empire. So Peter's half-sister, the regent Sophia, signed the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689. Although the Russians were now allowed to trade with China, Russia could no longer expand directly east. Although St. Petersburg was Peter's primary obsession, just before his death in 1725, he dispatched a Danish navigator, Bering, to explore the northeast corner of Asia. Yet, Russia remained shut out of the fertile lands directly to the south, modern-day Ukraine, but then a part of the Ottoman Empire. Peter had made a promising start. He built Russia's first navy to capture Azov from the Turks in 1696. But in 1711, excited by his triumph over Sweden, he sent his veterans south to capture the Ottoman-owned parts of the rest of the Ukraine. Unfortunately for Peter, the Turks played the old Russian trick against them. The Turks retreated until the Russian supply line became so long that they couldn't supply themselves, and then the Turks attacked. To make peace, Peter had to give back all of the lands he had conquered in the Azov War. To the south, Russia was left at square one. Though Peter had been in ill health for some time before his death, he still neglected to designate a successor. Like Marcus Aurelius, Constantine, and Ivan the Terrible, he left behind a big mess after he died. Peter's guards regiments proclaimed Peter's second wife Catherine as their empress. The actual government was run by Catherine's cronies until she died in 1727. Peter's 12-year-old grandson, son of the doomed Tsarevich Alexei, was then crowned as